and hear the word of God as we read it. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. If you say, the Lord is my refuge, and you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you, no disaster will come near your tent. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue Him. I will protect Him, for He acknowledges my name. He will call on me, and I will answer Him. I will be with Him in trouble. I will deliver Him and honor Him. With long life I will satisfy Him and show Him my salvation. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. This is the first Sunday in a while that 9/11 is on the Lord's Day. So I wanted to have us think about how God is at work in us and in our culture today. For 15 years since 9/11, we've been asked to be vigilant. It is hard to try to live a normal life and yet keep looking over your shoulder and being vigilant. Looking over your shoulder and being vigilant means you don't look down, you don't just keep straight ahead, but you look around and you see what is happening around you. There was a time when Homeland Security, for about 9 years, had these different colors of warnings for us, of alertness for us. And they were based on the Forest Service warning for the propensity to have a forest fire. There was green, which was low risk. There was blue, which was general risk. There was yellow, which is elevated risk, orange, high risk, and the worst was red, which is severe risk. And these were the warnings of the Homeland Security for 9 years. And for 9 years, it never went below yellow. It never went below high risk. And so they finally eliminated it because there's no sense in trying to keep everybody at elevated or high risk or severe risk all the time. It doesn't do much good. It never went to blue or green in the 9 years that it was set up. And this means that any person here under 18 years old cannot remember a time when they were not in a threat zone. Now, we don't need to wring our hands about that or wistfully wish for the past. The people in the Bible can teach us a lot about this kind of thing, about how to handle fear and terrorism, because the people of the Bible were constantly under a terror threat, and they didn't have any kind of a warning system. They didn't have any radar. They may have watchmen, but that gave you about a 30-minute notice. And they were all the time threatened by the Egyptians from the south, by the people from the Fertile Crescent, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Syrians from the north. They were threatened by the enemies nearby them, like the Elamites and the Midianites and the Canaanites. They were always under a threat. And time after time, the Bible records that the people were at war and they were surprised by the terror of war. And yet, in the midst of the terror, they found a great source of peace. And they found a source of protection. And this is what I want us to think about today, because I think it's important to think about the peace that God is able to give us in life and the protection that God offers us as well. Jesus, who certainly suffered and certainly, in my mind, faced the greatest terrorist act when the most innocent person in the world was tortured and beaten and crucified. Jesus said these words right before his crucifixion that we need to hear today. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, give I to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. Our passage in the Psalm says it like this: do not fear the terror of the night, or the arrow that flies by day, or the plague or the pestilence. Do not fear those things. Jesus said, not as the world gives, give I to you, this peace. But the world will tell us there's a lot to be afraid of. Think about what the world has told you to be afraid of. There's the Zika virus now. Last week I heard the West Nile virus was in Shandon, of all places. There's the Ebola virus. That's around too, and it's terrible what it can do. There's brain-eating amoebas. There's mad cow disease. There's the bird flu. You remember that one? There are all these things we could be afraid of if we really wanted to be afraid. The president said not long ago, trying to calm the fears of the people, that you are more likely to get hit by mundane things than to get killed by a terrorist. You're 17,000, for example, you're 17,000 times more likely to die of a heart attack than to die by a terrorist. You're 12,000 times more likely to die of cancer than to die at the hands of a terrorist. Yet, at least for me, I do not find the president's words that comforting. I wish somebody could say, just do this, and then you will never die. Just do this one thing, and you'll be okay. You'll never die. And you know what? That's what Jesus said. We have it inscribed on stone in our columbarium. He said it not naively. Jesus knew about death. I mean, in that time, death was all around. It was so common. In fact, his friend Lazarus had just died when Jesus said these great words, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though they were dead, yet shall they live. He who believes in me will never die. Do this, and you will never die. Do what? Believe in him. Trust in him. He is our shelter, our refuge, as the psalmist said. He is the one to whom we go. Now, Jesus died. He died on the cross. Lazarus, that he wrote this about, died, and then about 30 years later, he died again. And Jesus raised him again, I believe. Jesus, not long after he raised Lazarus from the dead, went into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. They proclaimed him as king, and within a week he was arrested and killed. The worst kind of terrorist death, I believe. And some people were saying of Jesus, see, what good is it to trust in God? Don't trust in God, they were saying basically. The criminals and the soldiers were saying, you saved other people, why don't you save yourself? The skeptics and the mockers were accusing him. They were quoting Psalm 22:8, which says, he trusts in God, let God deliver him since he delights in him. But the mockers and the skeptics could not see that even though he was dying on the cross, he was being rescued, even in the midst of his death. And not long after that, he was raised to show us all there is hope beyond this life. That God's protection goes beyond this life, that God's blessing goes beyond what you can see, that there is hope beyond what we know. And if you have this hope of the resurrection, this hope that even death cannot take away life, if you have that hope, you do not need to fear a terrorist. You do not need to fear cancer or Alzheimer's or a stroke or a heart attack. You do not need to fear war. Have the courage of Jesus. Jesus didn't run away from the people who were trying to arrest him. He didn't hide. He preached openly in the temple courts. He had great courage because he trusted in the Father, even in the face of death. And we should trust in the Father as well. Our psalmist reminds us that God is able to protect us. It says, whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge, my fortress, and my God in whom I trust, my shield, my rampart. If you make the Most High your dwelling, no disaster will come near his tent, your tent. So God is saying he can protect us. He can bless us with his protection. There are many examples in the Bible of this. They're recorded to encourage us to not be afraid even in the face of overwhelming odds. Abraham rescued Lot against an army with just a few men. But God rescued Abraham and Lot, and Abraham gave God the glory for his protection for that. The people of Israel at Passover were rescued from the Egyptians by the blood of the Lamb, and they gave God the credit for his protection in that. God provided and protected the godly prophet Elijah in the midst of a drought, in the midst of a famine, in the midst of an economic depression. He protected Elijah and provided him in a very special way to show that God can provide. And even when Ahab was the king was trying to specifically kill Elijah, he could not. Jeremiah was protected in the fall of Jerusalem that he had prophesied some years earlier. And when the people of Jerusalem were massacred in 70 AD, most Christians escaped because they remembered the prophecy of Jesus that when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, flee to the hills. And so they did. And the gospel lives on, and we are here today in part because they escaped that devastation. But is it possible to believe that God protects when so many good people died at 9/11, or good people died at the fall of Jerusalem? There are those who say God does not protect at all. But I want to tell you a few stories that I know personally that encourage me and remind me that God does. We do not always understand it. We do not always deserve it. In fact, I know we don't deserve it. But it is clear that God is able to protect and bless. At 9/11 in 2001, there were 50,000 people that could have been in those towers. The casualties could have been as high as 50,000 instead of 2,700, which was more than enough, but it could have been a lot worse. Christine lives in Lexington. Now, my son works in a gym, and because he works in a gym, I have to go to the gym, and Christine is there to help me get stronger and lose a little weight, which is good for me. Christine works at the gym, and Christine moved here from New York City. She worked in the World Trade Center. And she lost a baby, and she was out on maternity leave from that when the World Trade Center was attacked. And everybody that she worked with on her floor was killed. Everybody. She went to 30 memorials, not funerals because they couldn't find the bodies, 30 memorial services in 10 days. And if you ask Christine, how did this happen to you? She would say, I know that the Lord protected me in the midst of all that. I had a friend of mine in Georgetown. His name was Bill Barbuto. He was a captain for the New York City Fire Department. He retired about 2 years before 2001 because he had a herniated disc and he felt like he couldn't lift the things that he needed to lift as a firefighter. Everybody in his battalion that he worked with was wiped out in the World Trade Center. Everybody. He lost 300 friends, he said, in 9/11. And if you ask Bill, how were you protected? He would tell you, the Lord protected me in that. And I know others, he said, that God protected in the midst of that disaster. Shep Shepard is a nominee for elder here. We're going to vote in a few minutes. He was a colonel at the Pentagon on 9/11. He worked most of the night, and he decided that he would go for a run that morning. He had no idea the World Trade Center was being attacked about the time that he left for his run. He ran to the Washington Monument and came back, not knowing what had happened at the World Trade Center. And he came back just in time to watch a jet full of 36,000 pounds of jet fuel crash into the Pentagon. God does protect us. Why are some preserved and some are not? I do not know. Do you know? Are we supposed to know? I don't think we are, not till we get to the other side. But I do know that we all will one day die from a terrorist or a disease or cancer or whatever. And I do know that I'm not angry about that, for I have hope. And I hope you have that hope too. The Bible gives some conditions for God's protection. And you know what that condition is? Go to Him for protection. It's like God is a fortress, and we're supposed to run into the fortress for protection. He is our refuge and our strength. We're supposed to go to Him for protection. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, our passage says, rests in the shadow of the Almighty. Trust in Him. Go to Him as your protection, as your help. What is the alternative? Trust in yourself, in your abilities, the police, the army. Go to God. He is our ultimate hope, the hope that goes beyond this life. And when God has got you, He has got you. No one can take you out of the palm of His hand. Jesus quoted this psalm when He said that. Nobody can take you out of the Father's hand. God is called our protector in many different ways in the Bible. He is called our shield, our fortress, our refuge, our strength, our guardian, our defender, our tower, our rock, and many other titles as well. They are all reminders to us that no matter what happens in this life, go to God and look to Him as your help and as your strength. I've said for 15 years we are told to be vigilant. We're told to look over your shoulder, so to speak. But there's another over your shoulder besides a terrorist who may pop up on a rare occasion. There is someone who is always there, and that is God. That is God. God is always there. Look to him. You know, in World War II, the whole world was just obliterated. There was so much destruction in Europe and in so many different places in the world. And many Christian people turned away from God in Europe at that time because of the destruction that they saw around them and their inability to put their faith in God in the midst of that destruction. And yet, in the United States, the opposite happened. While Europe's faith went down, you can go to Europe today and find empty cathedrals and empty churches. In the United States, from 1945 to 1965, there was a huge revival. And churches were built and churches were full from people who were grateful that they got through it all and that they realized that God was their refuge and their strength. And it was in World War II, at the end of World War II, that Walt Disney published that song. It's still one of the top 100 songs in American history, whoever measures those kind of things. It's Mr. Bluebird's on my shoulder. It's the truth. It's actual. Everything is satisfactual. Now, how could he say that after World War II? Americans at that time seemed to turn to God with their heart and trust in the midst of the tragedy. And so many Americans died, and so many Americans were wounded, and so many Americans were hurt, and yet they still trusted in God. And that is an example to us as well. There's more over our shoulder than a terrorist or a bluebird. I invite you to look to God, who is our source of peace, our refuge and our strength, the reason for optimism, the reason for hope in life is not found in ourselves or in wishful thinking, but in the Lord, who can take even death and turn it into a resurrection. Trust in him. Find your peace in him. Amen.